There's two forms of investing when it comes to property. Passive investing, which is essentially when you buy a piece of real estate, whether it's residential or whether it's commercial, you put tenants in it and you essentially just let the rental income roll in, you pay your mortgage and expenses, and over a period of time, the mortgage starts to decrease and your rent starts to increase and it starts generating you a passive return. Now, of course, you still need to do some things to those pieces of real estate, but it really is as passive as it can come. Or there is another type of real estate investment, which is what I like to call an active investment. Now, an active investment is essentially exactly what it says on the label. It is active. And what I mean by that is it is a piece of real estate that you can be actively involved in, and you can either do a development, you can buy a property and run a business from that property to generate more cash flow. You can renovate an asset. You can add a second dwelling to an asset. It is essentially a piece of real estate that you are much more actively involved, and you can obviously generate stronger returns because you are committing more of your time and generally more capital. Now, up until only recently, all of my investments were in the top bucket. They were passive because I started investing when I was 18 and I'm now 28. And over that last 9-year period, I've essentially just been buying real estate, allowing that piece of real estate to grow, growing my income so I can increase my serviceability, and then using the equity to buy more real estate. And I was rinse and repeating that strategy. Now, over the last 12 to 24 months, my strategy, because I've gained more experience, I've gained more capital, and I've gotten the ability to take larger risks, the investments I'm making are now becoming more active in nature. And to be honest, I am much preferring the active investment strategy as opposed to the passive investment strategy. Now, to be clear, I could never have gotten to the active investment strategy if I did not start with being a passive investor, because the passive investments built my capital base to be able to start doing active investments. Now, there is an asset that I'm currently working on, which is a large farm. This is the farm. It is a 1,500 acre property. Now, generally, I would not tell people to go and buy a 1,500 acre farm because a 1,500 acre farm costs a lot of money. And if you were to just passively rent the property out to a normal tenant, it would generate a pretty poor rental yield and it would cost you a lot of money to hold. But what I am doing with this active investment is I've had the ability to generate many different forms of income. Because of that, it's also increased the value of that asset and will continue to increase the value of the asset pretty significantly. So there are 4 forms of income that come off this property. On the property, there is what we are doing, a wedding venue. The wedding venue takes up a very small portion of the overall property, but it is a big money maker. Now, this wedding venue is another company that essentially rents the venue off the owner of the property, which happens to be me. I also happen to own the wedding business. So the wedding venue operates there. Weddings range anywhere from $15,000 to $40,000. And obviously the property doesn't get all of that income because the income needs to stay within the company like a normal organization to run the company. But do you think a wedding venue company can pay a higher amount of rent than a standard mum and dad investor? I can give you the answer if you're still wondering. Yes, they can. It can afford to pay a significant amount more. So the wedding venue pays rent to the property, which generates a significantly higher rental income than the property would be able to generate if it was just purely renting it out to a mum and dad investor. Now, another really cool thing is a wedding venue needs to maintain the venue to a standard so it can obviously charge a premium for weddings. So that is one stream of income that comes in to the property. Now, because this wedding venue occupies less than 5% of the total property, it means there is still 95% of the property that is not being occupied. So we have another form of revenue, which is a cattle farm. Now, the cattle farm takes up 90 to 95% of the overall property. Now, unfortunately, cattle does not generate as much income as a wedding venue, but it does generate income And it does come with advantages that are advantageous to this kind of property. As a cattle farmer and running a primary production business, there are certain tax advantages that you get to be able to run the business off the property. So that is the second form of income that comes into the property. Now, we also have another form up here, which is not necessarily income, but it is capital improvement. What I mean by capital improvement is that because we have a property of this scale that runs a wedding venue, that runs a cattle farm, obviously it requires capital to improve the value of the asset. So you have improvements that need to be made. You have buildings that need to be built. You have landscaping that needs to be done. For cattle, you have fencing, you have yards, you have water troughs, you have pasture improvement, etc. So all of the capital improvement that happens because of these businesses that run out of their property, you then get the uplift of the value of the asset. So because these businesses are running from the property, the improvements they need to make to the property then increase the value of the property. So if you go buy a rural property today that is 1,500 acres that can run 500 head of cattle year round, that property is going to be worth a significant amount more than the same 1,500 acre property that can't run any cattle, that has no water security, that has no improved pastures. So because this business is running and it is generating income while it's running, and that income is obviously going back to improve the property, that directly correlates to the value of the asset being improved. Now, obviously a wedding venue, because it's landscaping, because it's making the property more valuable, because it's building a brand around the property. And the best thing about weddings is when they happen, it's the one event of the year that everyone wants to show to all their friends and family forever. So you get this free marketing and this cycle of people seeing it, wanting to visit there. You know, someone famous or popular gets married there and then everyone wants to follow trend. That increases the value of the property. So the capital improvement of the property is dramatically increased on top of whatever the marketplace is doing, simply because these two businesses are operating out of the property. Now, there was also another little one that I didn't mention, which is let's call this a bonus, short-term accommodation. For example, you have people who want to stay there for Airbnb. They might want to shoot an ad there. They might want to have a 40th or 50th birthday party. When there is no weddings happening there, it is also a little bit of bonus income that you have short-term accommodation. Now, the best thing about these kind of venues is that the short-term accommodation rates, because of the scale, are significantly higher. Now, to let everyone know what I paid for this property, I paid $5.5 million. We've spent many millions on top of that since we've purchased it. But let's say I bought a property for $5.5 million. And I put it on Airbnb, just a standard house, for example, by the beach, you might get $1,000 to maybe $3,000 a night max. This property, because it can host such a large group, you might be able to charge 3, 4, maybe even 5 times that amount, depending on the time of year. So that is a little bonus bit of income. And the last piece of the puzzle is the actual real estate itself. Obviously, over a long period of time, real estate grows naturally because you own the real estate. You get the natural growth, but on top of the natural growth, you get obviously the uplift in the capital improvement because of the things that happen to the property. You're running a wedding venue out of it, and you are running property for cattle or any other livestock or farming, for example, and short-term accommodation. And because all of these things combined all point to Rome, the real estate becomes worth more and more money. Let's assume that we have the piece of real estate. Like I said, we bought the property for $5.5 million. Generally speaking, on a piece of real estate worth $5.5 million, let's assume that you got a 6% yield, which would equal around about $30K in income if you were getting a 6% net yield on $5.5 million, which is not a bad return. But if we say that we have the venue that is paying rent of 40 grand a month, for example, let's say you've also got the cattle, and on that piece of property you can run 200 head, and let's say that that also brings in 150K worth of income. You've got some short-term accommodation, and let's say that's rented out 10 times a year at 10 grand a time. That is another 100K of income. And the really cool thing about it is you also then have the ability to have personal use. So instead of getting 330 $100,000 worth of income at a 6% net yield. The venue is paying $480,000 per year to operate out of a small portion of it. You are then getting, say, $150,000 a year through cattle. So that will then give you $530,000 a year. And you then have, say, $100,000 from short-term accommodation, which gives you $630,000 a year of income. Naturally, there are some expenses that come along with that, but they are minimal because each of these operations look after themselves. So instead of getting $330,000 a year, you are receiving almost double the amount of income at $600,000 to $650,000. You would not be able to achieve this outcome if you did not go down the active investment route. Now, of course, active investing takes more time. It probably takes more capital as well. So of course it should yield a better result. It takes more of a skill set. But when you combine business and real estate together, like some of the biggest players in the world do. And if you think about someone like McDonald's, for example, the restaurant chain, that is why they are such a huge company. Outside of just operating the business, they own all the real estate that they operate out of. This is what an active investment strategy looks like when you have the capital and the skill set to be able to implement it. And that is why I really like the idea of active investing now. And you're going to see me do more and more and more of this because it allows you to combine a skill set and real estate expertise together to get a much superior outcome.